Today I'll be talking about suicidal thoughts and loss. This is not for those who are finding that their thoughts are getting worse. This is not for those whose thoughts are continuing for more than 2 weeks. This is not for those who are finding that they are thinking careful plans on how to commit suicide. Please, this is not for you. This is for people who are really, really struggling to deal with the loss that COVID has brought them. If you are finding that your thoughts are getting worse, if you are finding that your mood is getting worse, if you are finding that you cannot get rid of them no matter how hard you try, please go and see a doctor. I work a lot with post-traumatic stress, with people who've been victims of crime, where people who have found that their whole worldview has been turned upside down. And I find that what we are all going through globally can be compared to post-traumatic stress. If we ignore the physical symptoms and the psychological symptoms of post-traumatic stress, we're also looking at deeper symptoms of a complete change of a worldview. And sometimes people can feel quite overwhelmed by this. Their thoughts can be, I've had enough. This is enough. It's easier to opt out. We like to think of the world as a controllable, a benign, a place that has purpose. We like to think of the world as a good place to be. And when we're placed in a situation where we're looking at uncertainty and ugliness, it can become just overwhelming and too much. What we are dealing with now, at the moment, is a deep grieving. We are grieving that the world that we are lost. And these are the people that I'm talking to. A deep trauma puts you into a state of loss and grieving. You're grieving not only what you might have lost physically, what you might have lost financially, but you're also grieving a loss of belief in humankind. Most trauma I deal with is of a criminal kind. What we are dealing with now is a physical reality that has crept up on us just so unexpectedly. Our worldview is unrealistic. We live according to certain fallacies, but those fallacies have to keep us alive. One of the fallacies is that the world is predictable. The other fallacy is that we have some element of control. These are the two fallacies that have been taken away from us. When I was in my final year of school, I had to learn a poem by John Milton, and the poem was on his blindness. I've actually found that poem extremely helpful in times of difficulty, and I often think of John Milton and what it must have meant to him. John Milton was an academic. He was considered to be extremely important in civil life. He had great ambition for himself, and then in the prime of his life he started to go blind. This did not end John Milton's career. If anything, it deepened it. It became the defining point in John Milton's life, in that he grew into a more compassionate, a deeper, a more humble person. Suddenly it was not about his intellect, but it was about his heart. And John Milton's poetry is still seen as quite visionary. To quote John Milton, "To be blind is not to be miserable. Not to be able to bear blindness, that is miserable." John Milton's poem on his blindness is the struggle of a man who is trying to come to terms with his greatest gift, his purpose seemingly taken away. And as this poem on his blindness, this has perhaps cemented him in history more than any of his academic works. One of the people I most admire is Nelson Mandela. I've been privileged to be able to watch his life, to watch his rise, to watch what he has brought to the world. And yet, most of his life was spent in prison. Much of his life was not spent governing a country, but much of his life was hard labor, something that also nearly rendered him blind. Nelson Mandela, if we think of him today, we think of him as an icon of forgiveness. As a South African, I really expected a civil war. Were it not for Nelson Mandela, there would have been many, many, many dead people, many more than in actual fact there were. We cannot count the cost of his sacrifice. This is a period of loss for all of us. We can either be miserable in the loss or say, what does this mean to me personally? I think one of the things that Nelson Mandela and John Milton had is that they had a purpose, both of them, of something bigger than themselves. John Milton was probably the first person who spoke about freedom of the press, something in his day that was quite unexpected. Nelson Mandela was willing to give his life for the liberation of his own people, for his freedom. Nelson Mandela was quite prepared to die, and he stood up and gave a speech that rendered the whole world captive, but he was prepared to die. A big thing during this period is to say, am I going to be miserable in this loss? And we will be miserable in this loss unless we can somehow reach out for a purpose that is greater than ourselves. Our biggest challenge right now is to look at the whole element of purpose. A purpose that is purely material is not going to get you through this crisis. A purpose that is greater than yourself is going to lead you into a deepening. So often I work with people who have overcome the most unbelievable obstacles, and they really are heroes in the world. When I work with them, their refrain is, were it not for the difficulties, I would not have made it. Were it not for the mistakes, I would not be where I am today. What unites these people is very often that they did have a purpose. They had some meaning. Maybe that meaning was their family. A family is a truly, truly divine purpose because it is about attachment. It is something meaningful. But right now, it's very, very frightening if that very thing that you want to protect and care for is under threat because of economy and because of finance. Our worldview has been turned upside down. And I think the whole aspect of security is now something that has been taken away from us. And we have to find ways in which we can redefine who we are and how we're going to go forward.